Hello. We are proceeding from the fifth published segment or part of Property and Capital. This one was published in Prometeo 1950 in issue number 14. And the section we start with, and I think this is the only section in that part, is section 6, Capitalism and Urban Property. The organization of the economic and legal relationships that refer to urban buildings and land in the era of modern capitalism may seem to have a general weight lower than that represented by the agricultural sector on the one hand and by the industrial production on the other. Apart from the consideration that the volume of the economic movement represented by the management of the house is not negligible, since it represents a fairly high fraction of the budget of each family in the average population, in Italy in normal times and for certain social strata even more than a quarter, the question turns out to be very interesting, since its examination allows us to elucidate in a very expressive way the interplay of fundamental economic elements and relations for understanding the current development of capitalism. Especially for the distinction between relations of titular and patrimonial property, which in a certain sense represent the statics of the private economy, and the continuous management and operating relationships of income and expenditure, which constitute its dynamics. For the sake of the order of the exposition, let us mention the historical origin of private urban tenure, a topic worthy of lengthy study and exposition. The process is quite different from that which led to the definition and limitation of agricultural possessions. When the nomadic tribes settled on fertile lands, there was a shift in various ways from communal enjoyment and cultivation to the identification of individual and family camps. Through innumerable upheavals and turmoil, it came to the classical and well-codified Roman system, then to the feudal system until, as we have covered in the 4th and 5th chapters, with the victory of the bourgeoisie, the agrarian land became marketable, and the legal discipline was again copied from the Roman one. The vicissitudes of habitation cannot be identified with those of the agrarian field. The ancient nomad or semi-nomad, hunter, fisherman, gatherer of wild fruit, then primordial cultivator, carries with him his dwelling, wagon, leather tent, or easily improvises it in the rudimentary hut or natural caves. With the formation of stable private agrarian estates, the population devoted to cultivation built the primitive fixed rural dwellings for the most part by themselves. Up to the present day, these are to be treated from the point of view of land as well as that of productive management, in the same way as agricultural facilities, with which human work has furnished the bare vegetable land over the centuries. Instead, we want here to follow the rise of the urban habitation. It is evident that the first agglomerations of stable buildings did not arise out of the direct needs of the non-farm production technology, the initial manufacture being in less developed eras compatible with the scattering of the population and the utilization of the daily and seasonal margins of the farmer's time. More, therefore, than the early forms of handicrafts and the manufacture of non-natural products, it was the needs of political and military social organization that determined the first rise of cities. It may therefore be held that the urban area was born in a collective regime, and only later broke up into individual domains corresponding to the needs of administration, defense, and domination in relation to scattered masses or foreign invaders, and thus the whole urban belt belonging to the king, the tyrant, the military captain, the first forms of state, sometimes to priestly associations. This is what tradition means by speaking of Romulus and Remus drawing the city walls of Rome by transforming the first rural tool, the plough, into a building machine. Then the needs were felt for fortified defense. The Greek polis had at its heart the Acropolis, or citadel. One of the Latin terms for city is oppidum, meaning fortified place, while civitas, or rather than a topographical indication, is a legal term for statehood. In the same Roman period, with the enlargement of the city and ever-widening city walls, with the rise of a ruling class of patricians owning vast agricultural estates and numerous slaves, there were the private aids and insulae, and also a fractioning of urban property among lower-class dwellings. The state, nevertheless, whether republican or imperial, retained tight control over the whole urban complex, demonstrated by the great importance of the magistracy of the aediles. Down to the other traditional reflection that tells us of Nero, a fanatic for grandiose projects of urban renewal, who apparently would not hesitate before the radical means of setting fire to the quarters of the urbs. In the Middle Ages, the development of large centers was a retreat from the splendor of the Asian and classical capitals. Feudal manors sprung up around them, or at their foot, clustered villages, lodging first servants and serfs, then gradually master craftsmen and independent merchants. It was with the modern bourgeoisie that towns were born and enlarged. They, surpassing all considerations of military defense of seigneurial or dynastic powers, break down and overrun the narrow walls and ramparts, and expand to form the huge contemporary agglomerations within whose circle are amassed in gigantic factories and establishments the millions of workers that modern productive technology has concentrated. A fundamental Marxist thesis is the close relationship between the spread of industrial production and bourgeois economy and the massive social phenomena of urbanism. Quote, "The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and thus has rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life." End quote. This is from the manifesto. Perhaps it was Italy, followed by the Netherlands, that provided the first examples in the late Middle Ages of large cities of the modern type. The great palaces and the imposing complexes of civic houses not only bear the names and coats of arms of the great noble families, they belong to firms formed by plebeian people who had accumulated the first great capitals in banking, commerce, and navigation, and already invested a considerable part of them in urban construction, while the most important master craftsmen made themselves masters of the building that housed their workshop, as the shopkeeper of Rome was of his taberna. As modern capitalism spread to other states, there sprang up young and newborn bourgeois industrial cities like Manchester or Essen, or large suburbs of the historical capitals that after the fall of the old regimes increased their population numbers disproportionately, becoming the Great Paris, Great London, the Great Berlin of today. While overseas, other bourgeois cities were founded, bare of the historic districts, recognizable in their layout by the monotonous orthogonal grid marked by the standard of this mercantile time and the inhuman laws of the race for profit. As for the legal mechanism, that of the Roman and Justinian codes, as it lent itself very well to capital's conquest of agrarian land, it served in the codes of the new bourgeois powers to regulate excellently the possession, acquisition, and transfer of urban property, both with regards to existing buildings and to land available for building. A special legal discipline served the sorting of the rights of private individuals over separate buildings split into individual floor or apartment properties, with the institution of condominium for divided parts. If the capitalist speculation of the new masters of society had wide-ranging developments in the investment in agricultural estates and their transformation according to the new demands of consumption and utilizing the new means and productive forces, it was able to accomplish even more resounding exercises everywhere with the free trade in building sites and a continuous escalation of their value, which in the old and new worlds reached hyperbolic heights. Although the same rules of law dictate how the market for agricultural land and urban land is to be conducted, establishing the equivalence between the real estate land value and the sum of numeraire into which it is converted, and in economic reality the two things are very different. Agrarian land is attributed a value due to the legal owner, to whom remaining unchanged flows the continuous annual revenue of the land annuity. Starting from the physiocrats who wanted, in defense of the feudal regime, to make an apologia for the productive forces of the land as opposed to that of manufacturing and industry, conservative economic schools maintain the concept of a basic productivity of the land, even the least endowed, without and before the effort of labor bestows a product. The improved crops made possible by the contribution of further investment of labor in the form of various facilities and constructions, and also periodic interventions with tillage, fertilization, and so on, add, for the official economy, to that basic yield, a new revenue that constitutes the profit of the agrarian enterprise. Apart from the different Marxist position on the question, for which, as we have seen, land has no productive force in of itself and is an instrument of labor, the land rent cannot rise beyond certain limits with respect to the given extent of land and the time of its proceeds. If the same great land improvements make it possible in the present economic system to greatly increase the production of commodities, they nevertheless require the investment of capital still higher than the basic land value and impose very long waits and even annuity suspensions that brings a liability together with the interest on an invested capital. Thus, under the capitalist regime, agricultural land can increase in value, but within fairly narrow limits. Agrarian transformation, which would be of great interest for the common welfare, is seldom convenient for the bourgeois ruling class, and will not reach great development until after the end of capitalism. Quite other phenomena determine the market for urban soils and all that is built on them. In agrarian production, we have a certain balance between its importance as the patrimony of the one who claims title over it and as a contribution to production. Land regimes were not the most predatory. In the industrial economy, while the titular patrimonial values remain limited, the value of products and the mass of profit are enormously exalted. This survey will be carried out to bring to light the very modern trend towards capitalism without assets but with very high profits. But let us return to our building land and find an example of a maximum of assets concentrated on a small, completely inert extension, where not a lettuce plant grows and not an hour of human labor is invested. As long as the land is not sold for construction, there is no operating or management budget, no movable capital is needed, no taxes are even paid until precisely the property tax was established. This was intended to constitute a modern partial confiscation of private wealth, but in reality, it too is paid for through the various incomes of the wealthy classes, and in the case of our construction lot, it is only a minimal subtraction from the incessant increase in asset and market value, as a rule much stronger than that of monetary assets to which interest is allowed to be added. Now, this special form of the enrichment of the bourgeois classes is but one aspect of the primitive accumulation of capital, which starts from the impoverishment and capture in the grip of industrial urbanism imposed on small producers, free peasants, or artisans reduced to propertyless proletarians. It is a social fact. Through the concentration in limited urban spaces of masses of productive forces, ranging from man to machines and complex modern equipment, the basic condition of the enormous profit that industry offers to the bosses is the provision of areas in those privileged zones to house factories, offices, housing for the masses of wage earners. It is therefore possible that in the market for these areas, higher and higher sums correspond to the same expenses of land, and the marketable unit is no longer the hectare or acre, but the square meter or foot. The evolution of the complex urban organism takes place in directions that all lead to an increase in the cost of building land. As the intensity of traffic in the streets increases, although the increased speed of mechanical means facilitates the passage of a greater number of people and volume of goods at the same time, the widening of streets becomes necessary, and with each transformation, the blocks become smaller. At the same time, the advancement of technology makes it possible to increase their height, and thus on the same area there is a greater number of levels, rooms, and inhabitants. Having thus increased the exploitation utility of the land, the price the owner demands when he alienates it likewise increases. Using the criteria of current economics, the value of a plot of land for construction is estimated by calculating what the yield of the maximum building will be, and the expense of carrying out the construction is deducted, which is generally less than the value, previously mentioned, of the building. The difference is a premium that is due to the landowner. It is a land value, different in nature from that of rural real estate, which nevertheless generates an annuity as well when the landowner remains master of the edifice. For the sake of clarity, we note that in the lease of homes for living, no enterprise profit appears or results compatible to that of the agricultural tenant who passes on a fee to the landowner and then provides for the operation and cultivation of the land, remaining master of the product. The enterprise that built the building is not economically comparable to the tenant farmer entrepreneur. The former is satisfied with what it earns and disappears from the relationship. When we spoke of calculating the construction costs, we considered the profit of the building contractor to be included in it, as well as the commercial interest due to the liquid capital that remained frozen for the time of construction. In all these economic processes, the various figures may coincide in the same person, but it is necessary to distinguish them well in order to decipher the processes that economic determinism studies. Thus, in agriculture, one does not always distinguish between the landowner, the enterprising tenant farmer, and the salaried manual laborer. The large directing farmer agrarian brings together the first two figures in himself, the small settler, the last two. the small peasant landowner all three. Similarly, in building property, the owner of land can build there a little house he will inhabit, if not with his own hands, at least on a time and material basis, and by spending his own money on it. He will not only be an owner, but at the same time a banker, a building contractor, and his own tenant. We already saw that one Marxist text recalls how in England the industrialist often does not own the factory. In another text, which we will deal with very extensively in a moment, it is even noted that the owner of the house may not own the land on which it is built. Certain legal systems, in fact, make it possible to grant permission to build on the land, the owner of which receives a fee from the builder and the owner of the house. Similar, very interesting forms, let us say in passing, are spreading for constructions and installations made at their own expense by private speculators on land that is not theirs, but state-owned. That is, owned by the public entities, municipalities, provinces, states. Thus we have the concession, an institution that is spreading considerably, a type of capitalism without property. The sense of the economic movement of modern capitalist times is in the distinction, separation, severing between the economic figures of a production-consumption cycle, and not in their overlapping and confusion. Not only is this a fundamental and objective thesis, but it must be accompanied by another, whereby this sense of development of the capitalist world is what we, Marxists, its implacable revolutionary opponents, accept and develop as the basis of the transition to the collective economy. Getting back then to the edifice just built and belonging to a private owner, and having seen how its patrimonial title arises and is transmitted in the present order, let us examine its operation and management. Let us preface this, however, with an important concept of urban economics. Rural landed property is in a sense perpetual, since in the cycle of operation of the land physically reproduces its basic productivity, unlike, for example, a mineral deposit whose depletion can be calculated. The urban building, on the other hand, is not eternal. It is only literature that sings of exegi monumentum are perennius. Let me translate this. I elevated a monument more eternal than bronze. And even the architectural colossi of times past have a life, albeit a long one. They decay and die eventually. The normal residential building has for diverse reasons a limited life cycle. On the one hand, time wears out its structures, bringing them closer to collapse and ruin. On the other hand, the type of dwelling transforms with the progress of technology. It has to meet new needs, and it does so sometimes with devices that are less expensive than the old ones. As the text to which we refer also recalls, it happens at a certain point that the building is worth less economically than the land it occupies, its dwellings being worthy only of low rents, and its operating expenses having grown. The life cycle of an urban residential building can be quite variable. To give an example that contrasts poor with nabobs, losers with winners, Naples will be 300 years, New York 30. The landlord of the building derives his revenue from the rents paid periodically by the tenants. This revenue is by no means eternal and constant, and is not entirely available to the landlord. Opposed to it, which is usually called gross income, are a series of expenditures. Expenses for the custody of the building, the doorman, for the lighting and the clearing of the passages common to the tenants, hallways, staircase, etc. Expenses for the maintenance of the parts that wear out, general expenses for administration, and miscellaneous. In normal cases, an average share of vacancy or uncollected rents should be added. And finally, in order to provide for the deterioration of the building, it is necessary to set aside so-called amortization quota, that is, a periodic amount that, put to savings, can accumulate at the end of the building the sum required to be spent on rebuilding it anew. Adding up all of these expenses and deducting their amount from the gross income, also deducting the taxes that are paid to the public bodies, there remains the actual net income that the owner is free to enjoy. Current assessors derive the figure for the property value of the building from that of the capital value, which at the current interest rates would reproduce the net income. A closer analysis shows that this procedure runs into many inaccuracies because it implicitly admits the constancy in the future of many conditions that are in fact changeable. We have recalled all this to show by easy comparison the economic and social differences between the residential property business and the general productive business of agriculture and industry. These base their operating income on the realization of products, which they continuously generate and bring to sell in the market. With this gross income, they then meet the various expenses, among which there are two very important categories, which for the residential property owner are practically absent: the purchase of raw materials to be processed and the remuneration of wage labor. Thus, the relationship of letting homes lacks these three elements: production of goods, wages, and purchase of raw materials. There is indeed wear and tear and consumption of the house, but it is a small fraction of the annual budget, a minimal part of the capital stock, and the indicated economic provisions cover it. In contrast, in industry, those three items, products, wages, raw materials, not only represent the preponderant part of the annual budget, but can reach higher figures, in some cases, than the same asset value of the plant, even having provided in the cycle to keep it intact. In common law and economics, however, regular and contractual exchange of benefits and values takes place for the rental of houses, as happens when coins are given against a piece of bread. What does the tenant get in return for his money? Certainly not something he can take away or consume by destroying it. In the language of the bourgeois code, he gets the use of his dwelling, and he pays for it at current prices per unit of time. So the landlord simply sells the tenant the use, the possession of the house, the right to enter and remain in it. We see immediately how this exchange in Marxist economics is considered a commercial exchange between equivalents, in which it may well be that one party harms the other because all bourgeois trade is a web of cheating, in which it is always likely to be the better off who cheats the poorer. But there is no application of labor power to the transformation of materials, and so this is not an area of the field in which, by purchasing the particular commodity that is human labor power, the formation of surplus value and capitalist profit is generated. In the present mechanics of relations between contractors, those peculiarities of the lease relationship produce appreciable practical and legal disparities. They boil down to the material fact that the agricultural or industrial producer holds his commodity well in his hands, and to make him loosen his fingers, it is usually necessary to produce some money. That particular commodity, which is the possession of the house, even if we want to call it a product, is in the hands not of the master but of the tenant. If the latter does not pay, it takes a complicated judicial police mechanism to evict him. This is what the drivel and demagogy of bourgeois housing legislation in times of emergency and its exploitation by popularist and pseudo-socialist parties is based on. Before elucidating this point, however, we are obliged, in order to illustrate our thesis that the tenancy relationship is not a capitalist relationship, to prove firstly that we have not uttered a heresy or a humbug, and secondly that we have not discovered anything new at all. Lenin, in his cardinal papers, State and Revolution, quotes extensively from the best-known works of Friedrich Engels, such as Origin and the Family, Private Property, and the State, and Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science. But in chapter 4, he refers to a work by the same writer, much wrongly less known and less used in socialist propaganda. The title of the work is The Housing Question. Lenin makes use of what Engels says about the communist program on housing to lay out with his usual perspicuity the task of the state in the hands of the proletariat. The similarities and differences that run between the state of tomorrow and the present state of the bourgeoisie as to their form and as to the content of their activity. Lenin's concern is to arrive at two solid cornerstones. First, the state that will emerge from the revolution is a new and different machine that will be formed after having demolished and broken down that of the present state. Second, the functions of this new machine of power and its class intervention in the body of the old economy will be carried out in such a way as not to give rise to fear, as liberals and libertarians insinuate, that a new form of overpowering of exploitation of the masses by a circle of the privileged few will be built on the new power. The question of whether, so far, history has confirmed the Marxist and Leninist doctrinal construction on this point as well, surely cannot be approached without complete clarity in the positive investigation of today's economic and social relations. The field of the housing sector serves admirably for Engels and Lenin to measure the gulf that runs between the solutions proper to Marxist revolutionary critique and those peddled either by puerile utopians or by legalitarian and anti-classist reformisms. Engels' study bears the date 1872 and collects 3 articles published in the Leipzig Volksstadt. which the author brought together with a preface in 1887. Engels wrote them in rebuttal to writings by a certain Mühlberger, hosted in the same journal and completely deviating from the Marxist line in the Proudhonian sense. Engels takes from this the opportunity for a critique of Proudhon's petty bourgeois position, a position that under various names, before and since, incessantly resurfaces and undermines the Marxist directive. This is an exposition conducted with a master's hand in which, as always, Engels, the theoretical certainty accompanied by crystalline clarity of development and form, is astonishing. Perhaps Marxist literature does not possess, in the field of agrarian production, a text as complete and systematic as this one, which defines and exhausts the subject of urban property. And even the incomparable man who was Engels cares to make it clear, although apologetically, that in the division of labor between Marx and himself, it was up to him, Engels, to support their address in the periodical press, that the former could devote himself entirely to his masterpiece. And he adds that he wished, taking the opportunity presented by the house in question, to update the critique of Proudhon made in 1847 with The Poverty of Philosophy, concluding verbatim, Marx would have accomplished all this much better and more convincingly. The position against which, from the outset, Engels pinned his critique is the one that wants to solve the housing crisis, a modern phenomenon that has affected and affects repeated periods of the most varied countries, by a reform through which each tenant becomes the owner of the dwelling in which he lives through a redemption that pays its price to the landlord in installments. To this gross programmatic error, the refuted journalist arrives, of course, through blunders in economics, which Engels eliminates by brilliantly taking the opportunity to highlight the Marxist economic interpretation. One of the debunked theses is this: what the wage laborer is before the capitalist, so is the tenant before the landlord. Marx would perhaps have spewed flames and hurled thunderbolts at hearing these drum beats. Engels calmly says this is completely false, and he patiently and limpidly explains how it is, recalling the simple descriptive criteria we have set out above. He draws from this the refutation of the baleful calculation whereby the tenant, as a result of paying by month, would pay 2, 3, 5 times the value of the house. He also draws from this the opportunity to eviscerate not only the economic critique of so-called petty bourgeois socialism, but also its ethical legal obsessions. The columnist, who, like thousands of his comrades in sin, believed himself to be a Marxist, had let slip this other nonsense. Quote, "The house, once it has been built, serves as a perpetual legal title," end quote. For according to Proudhon, everything consists in successfully introducing into the economy, quote, "the eternal ideal of justice," end quote. Engels shows this hollowness of such language that would like to stigmatize the landlord's exaggerated profiteering as one once excommunicated that of the loan shark. And he quotes Marx, quote, "Do you really know any more about usury when we say it contradicts justice, eternal justice, eternal equity, and eternal mutuality, and other eternal truths than the fathers of the church did when they said it was incompatible with the eternal grace, the foi éternelle, and la volonté éternelle de Dieu, the eternal will of God," end quote. Between 1847 and 1887, an opponent was put down when convinced of theism. Marx and Engels, athletes of the polemic, would have a tougher task today, because Marxist scribes have slipped not only as far as Proudhon, but as far as the church fathers themselves. Since the incautious journalist is not content to design his miraculous structural reform for inhabited houses, but boasts of possessing a similar recipe for all other sectors, Engels extends the field of his fine-tuning on the Marxist description of the production process even to the question of the interest rate of capital, mocking the claim of finally taking the productivity of capital by the horns with a transitional law to fix the interest of all capital at 1%. Yeah. And likewise, still today, how many present the socialist struggle as a campaign to abolish house rent, land rent, and the yield of money, thinking that they have thus transported to earth the reign of morality by preventing those who do not work from earning, when instead it is a question of eradicating a whole entanglement of social forms protected and defended by the monstrous scaffolding of armed power concentrated in the political state. Ooh. Engels' response establishes that the productivity of capital is an absurdity that Prudhonism uncritically borrows from bourgeois economists. In truth, the classical bourgeois economist is more serious than the petty bourgeois and reformist economist, for after disputing with the physiocrats that wealth arose from the productivity of land and with the mercantilists that it arose from the productivity of exchange, he asserted precisely that it is labor that is the source of all wealth and the measure of the value of all commodities. To explain, however, how the capitalist who commits his capital to industry not only recovers it at the end of the bargain, but in addition makes a profit from it, he enunciated, wrapping himself in 1,000 contradictions, a certain productivity of capital. For Marxists, on the other hand, only labor is productive, not the property owner's fund or the house or the banker's money. The fund, the house, the factory, the machine are productive forces because they are instruments and means of production, that is, they are used by man to work. In the present arrangement, and until it is overthrown, the faculty of money and capital is not a productive faculty, but the social faculty, pertaining to it to appropriate the unpaid labor of wage laborers. Though being in possession of only a poor translation, let us cease paraphrasing and allow Engels to speak himself. Quote, "The interest on loaned money capital is only a part of profit. Profit, whether on industrial or commercial capital, is only a part of the surplus value taken by the capitalist class from the working class in the form of unpaid labor. But as far as the distribution of this surplus value among the individual capitalists is concerned, it is clear that for industrialists and merchants who have in their businesses large amounts of capital advanced by other capitalists, the rate of profit must rise to the same extent as the rate of interest falls. The reduction and final abolition of interests would therefore by no means really take the so-called productivity of capital by the horns. It would do no more than rearrange the distribution among the individual capitalists of the unpaid surplus value taken from the working class. It would not give an advantage to the workers as against the industrial capitalists, but to the industrial capitalists as against the rentier." End quote. To return to the thesis we are arguing in these pages, it is not the rentier, the lord of the lands and palaces, who is ripping us off, these poor leftovers of a bygone era, but the captain of industry, the entrepreneur, the very modern and progressive, and before the latter, we proclaim, here is the enemy. The Proudhonist imagines that this compression and final suppression of the interest of capital entails, in addition to a general wonderful pancreas for all other economic and social issues, credit, state debts, private debts, taxes, precisely the abolition of the house rent forever. Engels shows him that even if this simplistic plan were possible, it would not displace the fundamental capitalist economic relationship between wage earners and owners of production enterprises. He refers him over and over again to the foundations of Marxist economics and Marxist capital. Quote, "The cornerstone of the capitalist mode of production is, however, the fact that our present social order enables the capitalists to buy the labor power of the worker at its value, but to extract from it much more than its value by making the worker work longer than is necessary in order to reproduce the natural price paid for the labor power. The surplus value produced in this fashion is divided among the whole class of capitalists and landowners, together with their paid servants, from the Pope and the Kaiser down to the night watchman and below." End quote. Now, the commercial cost of the house, like that of bread, clothing, etc., enters into the expenses of reproducing labor power, into the part of this force that wages remunerate and constitutes the necessary labor. And it is beyond this that we come into the realm of surplus value or unpaid labor that appears in the price of the product along with that which is paid. As in all exchanges with money, the worker and every other buyer can be cheated. And in this exchange of his labor for wages, he must be cheated. The relationship in which the capitalist character of the economy is caught is the one in which the worker collects his wages, not the one in which he spends them between baker, tailor, landlord, and so on. Having clarified the question of economic analysis, Engels' study rebutes with no less energy the error of a social nature by accusing Proudhonists of always emphasizing, in every way, those claims that are common to wage laborers and the petty and middle bourgeois, but which, as a class, only the latter have an interest in defending, and shows how reactionary such a position is. He plucks the following nonsense from the opportunist rants. In this, quote, "In this respect, we are far below the savages. The troglodyte has his cave, the Austrian aborigine has his clay hut, the Indian has his own hearth, the modern proletarian is practically suspended in midair," and then etc. Still to be quoted in his text is Engels' magnificent refutation of the no less pestilential demand for rural parceling. Quote, "In this Jeremiad, we have the Proudhonism in its whole reactionary form. In order to create the modern revolutionary class of the proletariat, it was absolutely necessary to cut the umbilical cord which still bound the workers of the past to the land. The hand weaver, who had his little house, garden, and field, along with his loom, was a quiet, contented man, godly and honorable, despite all misery and despite all political pressure. He doffed his cap to the rich, to the priests, and to the officials of the state, and inwardly was altogether a slave. It is precisely modern large-scale industry which has turned the worker, formerly chained to the land, into a completely propertyless proletarian, liberated from all traditional fetters and free as a bird. It is precisely this economic revolution which has created the sole conditions under which the exploitation of the working class in its final form, in capitalist production, can be overthrown. And now comes this tearful Proudhonist and bewails the driving of the workers from hearth and home as though it were a great retrogression instead of being the very first conditions for their intellectual emancipation." End quote. Engels recalls that he first described in his work The Condition of the Working Classes in England how fierce this expulsion of the workers from home and hearth was, and continues, quote, "But could it enter my head to regard this, which was in the circumstances an absolutely necessary historical process of development, as a retrogression below the savages? Impossible. The English proletarian of 1872 is on an infinitely higher level than the rural weaver of 1772 with his hearth and home. Will the troglodyte with his cave, the Austrian aborigine with his clay hut, the Indian with his own hearth, ever produce a June insurrection and a Paris commune?" Then, end quote. Then Engels satirizes with a delightful illustration, which one could imagine was formed after reading today's Fanfani plan, the consequences of the imbecilic scheme, which was already being aired even in America at that time. As per a letter from Marx's daughter Eleanor about the exorbitant sale of little houses in the suburbs to the workers. To make every industrial worker buy his own little house in installments, and imagines a worker who, after working in various cities, owns a 50th of a house in Berlin, a 36th of one in Hanover, and even more complicated fractions in Switzerland and England, also that eternal justice may have no regrets. In conclusion, quote, "All these things which are held up to us here as highly important questions for the working class are in reality of essential interest only to the bourgeoisie, and in particular to the petty bourgeoisie. And despite Proudhon, we assert that the working class is not called upon to look after the interests of those classes." End quote. Of course, at this point, Engels, Lenin, and those of us who are so conservative that we have found nothing to overcome 77-year-old positions are asked what is to be done about housing. This is precisely the passage Lenin wanted to quote to show how little there is in common between a utopian extremism and the coherent positions of radical Marxism, as he says vividly about the outlook on the future economy. There is not even a grain of utopia in Marx, Lenin says. Engels' conclusion is in this, quote, "How is the housing question to be solved then? In present-day society, just as any other social question is solved by gradual economic adjustment of supply and demand, a solution which ever reproduces the question itself anew and therefore is no real solution. How a social revolution would solve this question depends not only on the circumstances which would exist in each case, but is also connected with still more far-reaching questions, among which one of the most fundamental is the abolition of the antithesis between town and country. As it is not our task to create utopian systems for arrangement of future society, it would be more than idle to go into the question here. But one thing is certain, there are already in existence sufficient buildings for dwellings in the big towns to remedy immediately any real housing shortage given rational utilization of them. Yeah, this can naturally only take place by the expropriation of the present owners and by quartering in their houses the homeless or those workers excessively overcrowded in their former houses. Immediately the proletariat has conquered political power, such a measure dictated in the public interest will be just as easy to carry out as other expropriations and billetings are by the existing state. Yeah. Lenin illustrates that this example shows a formal analogy between certain functions of the current bourgeois state and those that the dictatorship of the proletariat will exercise. But one thing is very remarkable. The war legislation of the bourgeois states went as far as the limitation and freezing of rents, the prohibition of the expulsion of tenants, just as in given cases the present legal mechanism provides for the expropriation against the compensation of private buildings for purposes of public utility. Marx at another point notes that the law of expropriation provides for compensation of the market value to the owner, but the tenant who has been driven to the street by the great modern urban renovations is not compensated for anything and is also subjected to transportation expenses, to the payment of higher rents, in addition to the very modern extortion of the so-called down payment for the new house, if he is so lucky as to find it. That is. Moreover, during military operations, the occupation of apartments for war-related uses or related services is now permitted. Yeah. The measure envisaged by Engels to compensate for the social disease of overcrowding, however, is radical and utterly original in comparison with all reformist plans seen so far of changes in legal ownership and the creation of new minuscule owners. It is a revision of housing use. The dreaded post-war housing commissioners could put whoever they liked into available houses, but they had no power to enforce cohabitation in apartments that were too large, and to criticize the fact that a wealthy family had, by way of ownership or lease, it matters little, 5 rooms per individual in cities where the poor occupy 5 to 1 in a room. Here is what will be truly a despotic intervention, which will deal a terrible blow to the private guarantee and security that has hitherto existed. These are the words of the manifesto, and which will make the revolutionary violation of the sanctity of the hearth and home scream bloody murder. The redistribution of the use of houses among the inhabitants of the city is therefore envisaged as an immediate revolutionary measure, while the decrowding of congested cities remains a further prospect. What will not fail to astonish many who believe themselves to be Marxists, however, is Engels' economic concept that the use of the house will not be immediately free. Throughout that stage, which Marx calls the first stage of the economic communism, and on which Lenin in turn lingers with reference to the famous letter to Braque on the Gotha program. Here is the other passage from Engels. Quote, "For the rest, it must be pointed out that the quote-unquote actual seizure of all instruments of the labor, the seizure of industry as a whole by the working people, is the exact contrary of the Proudhonist theory of gradual redemption. Under the latter, the individual worker becomes the owner of the dwelling, the peasant farm, the instruments of labor. Under the former, the working people remain the collective owners of the houses, factories, and instruments of labor, and would hardly permit their use, at least in a transitional period, by individuals or associations without compensation for the cost, just as the abolition of property in land is not the abolition of ground rent, but its transfer, although in a modified form, to all of society. The actual seizure of all the instruments of labor by the working people, therefore, does not at all exclude the retention of the rent relations. Only in the higher stage of communism, in which consumer goods and various services will not be remunerated with currency, will rent also disappear, with the general organization also providing for the maintenance and renovation of housing for all. One can well see the profound contrast between such a clear delineation and the progressive programs of the people's democracies, all of which consist of promising fragmentation of land rents, where, at the end of the day, there is not to be shared the 100th part of what the enterprises make off with, and not the thousandth part of what the mad disorder of production annihilates. The part of the gross income of the house that does not correspond to inevitable expenses, without which one could be deprived of with a certain period of time of habitable dwellings, and which can be considered land annuity of the soil, a function of privilege over the soil, even if this is, as we said, physically unproductive of fruits, belongs, says Proudhon himself, to society, and that's fine. This, Engels replies, means the abolition of private ownership over land, an argument that would take us very far. Engels evidently meant that, undoubtedly with the proletarian revolution and the subsequent nationalization of the land rent, all private ownership of land is abolished. Yet for urban land, it is not to be ruled out that such a reform could be done first by the bourgeois state itself. This would be a more serious matter than redemption by the individual tenant. Indeed, we see that today not a few urban planners, certainly not of the Marxist school, are proposing the state ownership of urban areas. This would be by the state or municipal authority in large cities, after full compensation to current owners, of course. These urban planners, in fact, start from the phenomenon of the very rapid increase in the value of land for building, in ever-widening rings encircling large cities, hence the apparent absurdity noted by Engels that it may be convenient to tear down a good building in order to speculate on the land. This makes urban reclamation and redevelopment very expensive and causes capital to shy away from it. Now even a good bourgeois advocate of the hereditary principle can say that this enormous reward, sometimes realized in much less time than a generation, is not the accumulation of wealth from father to son, but is manifestly the passive result of a series of social facts. All the land in the city would thus be off the market. The municipality would sort it into the appropriate stages among the streets, squares, public buildings, and dwelling houses. The construction of these may be given in concession for a term of several years, after which they revert to the municipal body. It is clear that such a plan, while by no means precluding the payment of rents by citizens, would not be revolutionary at all and would not undermine capitalist social principles. But can bourgeois society overcome the problems of urbanism with these and other plans? Current urban science feeds on technical architectural exercises and forgets that the foundation of the discipline is historical and social in nature. Powerless to react to the fact that the concentration of an increasing number of inhabitants on a minimal space, the urbanism of Le Corbusier and others who pass for highly advanced pushes buildings to dizzying heights and an absurd number of floors. Fantastic vertical cities rising to unnatural atmospheres, deploying metal structures that have transformed the technology and currently the aesthetics of buildings. But this trend appears futuristic only insofar as it does not know how to question whether the best direction of collective life and the forms it will take in the future correspond to this ghastly crowding of people thrust into an increasingly frenzied, sick and absurd life. In the second of his articles, Engels poses the theme precisely, how the bourgeoisie solves the housing question, and he refutes the hypocritically philanthropic bourgeois literature about unhealthy and overcrowded neighborhoods in modern metropolitan areas. The petty bourgeoisie is directly interested in the issue, and that point has been elucidated enough. But it is also affected, Engels says, by the big bourgeoisie. First, the dangers of infectious epidemics tend to spread from the slums to these genteel folk. The bourgeois ideal, which in town planning they call zoning, consists in a good discrimination between the working class and rich houses, but in the old cities there are still traces of the feudal organization that intermingled palaces and cottages, nobles, commoners, and serfs. Quote, capitalist rule cannot allow itself the pleasure of creating epidemic diseases among the working class with impunity. Let those who have depicted an old Engels as inclined to soften class enmities take note of this lively quilp. A second point concerns the political policing of cities and the suppression of armed insurrections, which until the second half of the 19th century had their day in the narrow widening streets of capital cities. Engels sees a class motive in the realization of large, wide, straight streets along which machine gun and artillery could wipe out insurgents. The later experience, if it confirms that the center of any insurrectionary effort is the conquest of large capitals and industrial cities, also shows that illegal armed guerrilla formations fare better and longer in the rugged countryside. A good technical example is given by Giuliano's forces, a famous Sicilian bandit of the time, in that they must be held not to be an advance outpost of distant staffs of regular forces. Thirdly, Engels illustrates the great capitalist speculative ventures supported by governments under the double aspect of building beehives to house workers near colossal factories, which tends to turn the free wage earner into a kind of feudal slave of capital, and of the reconstruction and transformation of the streets in central districts in large cities, citing several times the classic example of the Haussmann method with the great curé of the Second Empire, which created the Parisian boulevards in a speculative orgy. And all other nations have offered striking examples of this. The economic basis of these urban upheavals, examined in state financing, in the supposed self-help of workers, attacking their wages in private enterprise, leads the author to conclude that the driving force and outcome of it all is the social and political consolidation of capitalism. The fundamental Marxist theses on the urban real estate question are thus summarized by Engels himself in 5 points of his rebuttal to the Proudhonians. First, that the transfer of ground rent to the state is identical with the abolition of individual property in land. Second, that the gradual redemption of the rented dwellings and the transfer of property in the dwelling to the tenants does not at all affect the capitalist mode of production. Thirdly, that with the present development of large-scale industry in towns, this proposal is as absurd as it is reactionary, and that the reintroduction of ownership of his dwelling by each individual would be a step backwards. And then fourthly, that the compulsory reduction of the rate of interest on capital would by no means attack the capitalist mode of production, and that, on the contrary, as the usury laws prove, the idea is as old as it is impossible. Fifthly, that the abolition of interest on capital by no means abolishes the payment of rent for houses. With respect then to the direction of big capitalism and the urban planners in this service, with regard to the unfolding of the life of urban organisms, and with regard to the scarcity of housing, there are two other points taken from the text which are Marxist theses. Then, sixthly, a society in which the great working mass is obliged to turn exclusively to wage labor in order to procure the means of living, in which the house owner, in his capacity as capitalist, has not only the right, but in view of the competition, to a certain extent also the duty of ruthlessly making as much out of his property in house rent as he possibly can, cannot exist without a shortage of housing. In such a society, the housing shortage is no accident. It is a necessary institution and can only be removed when the whole social order that gives rise to it is undermined from the foundations. And then seventhly, the bourgeois solution of the housing question comes to grief because of the antithesis between town and country. Capitalist society, far from being able to remove this antithesis, can only exacerbate it more and more. Wanting to solve the housing question while wanting to maintain modern cities is nonsense, but these will only be removed by the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, by the appropriation for the working class of all means of life and labor. Deserving of a separate note are the masterpieces of Italy's fascist and fascistoid public administration on the subject of rent freezes and housing reconstruction, and the corresponding attitudes of dirty demagoguery on the part of the movements that, under the pretense of representing it, shame the working class and its great traditions. Every day we have seen electoral speculations and charlatanry grafted onto the frequent tragic business of factory and land occupation. We have not yet seen experimentation with the invasion and occupation of homes. The reason is, among other things, that it is not only the business people of the super bourgeoisie and no more the ghosts of barons, but also too many fresh demagogues and members of the elite on either side of the Iron Curtain would be disturbed in their standard of living as parasites. That's the end. Now we continue on to part 6, which was published in Prometeo 1950 in number 1. This was when the series restarted. And this doesn't start off with, I think in the original it ends with a note to chapter 6, which is quite bizarre. So I decided to put the note to chapter 6 right next to chapter 6, right after it, because that makes the most sense, even though it's in the next part. This note is called The Real Estate Problem in Italy, and it follows the same theme, to talk about the topic and to give a historical framing of it in the Italian context. Let's start. Like any regime, at the approach and outbreak of war, Italy's all-powerful super-state fascism took to wielding all the levers of its power to arrest the general rise in prices and the corresponding depreciation of money. We are not concerned here with the issue that the general rise in prices and monetary inflation are aligned with the interests of the business class, its state, and its government, and that only reasons of conservative social policy and demagoguery inspired the legislative arsenal of Imperium to curb the rise. The price freeze laws, launched in 1940, covered everything: products of land and industry, wages, salaries, and remunerations, and ongoing contracts the state had for works and supplies with the most diverse enterprises. Among the most interesting were the measures directed at freezing the rents of both rural and urban real estate. The first relationship is less simple. The tenant of arable land does not merely rent a site on which he acquires the right to sojourn and reside, as would be the case if it were a jardin de délices, but a real instrument of production to which he applies his own labor or that of his salaried employees. In order to draw from it fruits and products realizable in money on the market. Elsewhere, we have alluded to the foolish confusion between the social and political scope of the struggle to compress the agrarian tenancy, and at first sight the merciless landowner income, depending on whether the beneficiary of the lesser paid rent is a parcel laborer, a dirty fat bourgeois settler, or even a capitalist entrepreneur in agricultural industry who flays laborers and sometimes subtenant laborers. In case of urban real estate, and to be more exact, the urban home, because of its simplicity, it lends itself in a crystalline way to the proof of fundamental theses of Marxist economics. It constitutes the only case in which the freeze was effective and successful. Before we wonder whether this success corresponded to the interests of the working class, as it appears at first glance, and as it is convenient to say when churning out agitprops by the dozen, we shall note how it demonstrates, because of the relative narrowness of the sector, along with the rightness of Marxist concepts, the inconsistency and paucity of the controlling and planning capacities of the modern state in the economic field, even where it shows itself to be solid as concerns its political and police control. While in all fields of agrarian and industrial labor what matters is less, as we are going to show in these notes, the pompous proprietary title to places and facilities than the mastery and possession of products, the leased house produces nothing movable that can be carried or sold, but only offers the convenience, the servitude, the use of it as a shelter and living room. The state can dictate, and already in this it has taken a step that is a theoretical defeat of capitalist economics, that a product, such as a hat, not be sold for more than 100 liras. But by its very historical and social nature, the present state cannot force 1 to 1,000 hats to be sold at 100 liras if the producer and owner does not bring them to the market of his own free will. The state, it is said, can register and requisition all hats wherever they are found. In practice, there arises the difficulty of unearthing the hats, and if they are to be taken away, by paying for them all, albeit at 100 liras. That is why the economic fact known by all is that as soon as the price of hats is frozen, capped and fixed by Imperium, they disappear from circulation and are hoarded not to be sold except secretly, at a price increased still further by a fee to cover, for the seller, the risk of fines and prison. Black markets. The buyer, therefore, is subjected to the black or illegal market unless he wants to go without a hat. Many heads today go without a hat, and many wander empty, especially those of the experts in political economy. But it's the stomachs that cannot go empty, as the legs would fail. That's why nothing could prevent the rise in prices, not only for hats, but also for foodstuffs and necessities. Now the house comes to the tenant from the landlord, not brick by brick, but altogether as soon as the contract has run its course. The same landlord cannot set foot in it without the tenant's permission. While in every other market the seller is the price's arbitrator, as they can always say impassively, well, if you don't like the price, leave me the merchandise. For houses, the arbitrator, once inside, is the buyer who pays. Normally, if they don't pay the subsequent rents after the first one or the ones paid at the time of the contract, or if they pay less, the landlord must resort to a long and expensive legal eviction procedure and rarely to the recovery of unpaid rents. In the general case, it is the buyer who has to give in or run to wine to the state to force a sale. In the case of housing, it is the seller of the house service who has no other alternative than to call the state when they are not paid. The state thus pulled the fine stunt. Tenants oppose any demand for a rent increase, pay the old rent and not a penny more until the war is over, and I will take care not to let the cops to drive you out. While industrial, commercial and financial capitalism unleashed all the claws of the wolf and the tiger, the terrible state, whether democratic, popular or national, boasted on the cheap about its social and moral credit for clipping the nails of the timid kitten of urban property. It did not go so far as to control or discriminate one jot, freezing the rent of that a poor unemployed family paid to a billionaire housing landlord just as much as that which by chance a large industrial establishment paid to occupy the only small cottage in the possession of family of starving petty bourgeois. As we have mentioned, it was not the modern dirigist and planning approach of public powers for the general interest that triumphed, but the traditional article that summarizes all the wisdom of bourgeois law. Articolo quinto, ci tiene in mano ha vinto. Article 5 states that whoever is in possession of something wins. It's the Italian equivalent of possession is 9/10 of the law. So this measure, which came effortlessly out of Benito's cranium, has been inherited, defended, and paraded as an easy element of success, especially electoral, by today's socialists and communists. While the capitalist state on the one hand and proletarian leaders on the other, from then to now, with an equally common indifference and impotence, have had to witness the dizzying rise of all costs and the progressive depression of working people's living standards, both during the war and after the war. An imbalance for which the one-off of economized housing falls far short of plugging the painful gaps. The policy of rent compression or its abolition by transforming the tenant into a small property owner is fundamentally non-socialist, as we thoroughly demonstrated with reference to Engels' classical writings. Engels ridiculed the analogy between the relationship of a tenant to a landlord and the relationship of a worker to an employer, drawing magnificent lessons on Marxist economics from it. The worker exchanges his labor power for money, while the tenant exchanges his money, in installments, for the use of the house. Therefore, the tenant is not an exploited producer, but a consumer, even a privileged consumer, as he holds the object of consumption in his grasp, whereas it is typically the seller who holds it in his grasp. However, the three-penny agitator says, on behalf of the worker, we, Benito and I, have prevented expensive housing from being added to the expensive bread, expensive hats, and expensive shoes, so he is less exploited. But a brief analysis shows that the social burden on the working class, on whom everything weighs and cannot help but weigh, has not diminished because of the effects of the foolish, lopsided, and trap-like Italian legislation on rents, signed by the Justice Ministers Grandi, Togliatti, or Grassi. Having cut the landowner's annuity, it has cut in vivo into the contribution for social purposes that provide for the maintenance of the housing endowment, the result of the work of generations. This damage is of greater volume in Italy than that of wartime bombings. In Italy, the real estate stock, especially with regards to housing, is of very high average age, and very high is the cost of maintenance. Omitting it accelerates deterioration. This should be balanced by intensified new construction, which in a capitalist environment comes to a complete halt because the low rent prevents a return on investment, and before that, through the general effect of the wartime economic crisis. Thus, the housing supply available to the Italian population has not only decreased in absolute numbers, when it should be increasing for demographic reasons and for reasons of decrowding and land reclamation, but the pace of the decrease has been exacerbated by the rent freeze policy. This means that as the number of houses has decreased and the number of inhabitants has grown, crowding, which was already one of the worst in Europe, has grown frighteningly, and it has especially grown to the detriment of the poor classes, squeezed into old and unhealthy houses, who pay less for housing, but also consume less and often lack it altogether. A strange inequality having thus been created between the rent-frozen houses and houses free of rent, it comes about that the few new-build constructions that can be rented at any price with today's cost data, capital abstains from all these new builds that cannot render more than 2,000 lire per room per month, to put it mildly, and net income of 20,000 lire per year, only remunerates a capital of 400,000 lire at 5%, which is not enough to build the room. The end result is that all the subsidies of the special laws go to houses for the wealthy classes, and none go to the poor. The appearance that the proletariat pays a lower portion of its income for the mass of houses it once occupied gives way to the reality that between high prices and taxes and by living in rat holes, workers pay in 1,000 ways for the houses built for the gentry. In France, they noted that while between 1914 and 1948 for all economic indices grew 200 times, that of rents grew 7 times. The working class now pays 4% of the wage for housing, and they propose to bring it back to 12%, which does not detract from the fact that in construction, capital delivers only 1/5 of the normal yield, and therefore the state has to pay 4/5 of it for new working class houses. Now it is more convenient for the worker to pay for someone else's house at a high price than to pay at an average price for the house built at his own expense. That absurd diversity in the adjustment of economic indices carried over to the currency is balderdash, one of the many of the capitalist regime, one more element for the burden that economic anarchy places on the shoulders of the workers. Never proof that even in the narrowest field the modern state wants, can, or knows how to deliver justice, or even the mitigation of the social divides. Today's Italian legislation offers another masterpiece. Couldn't they have in some city an annual festival of the laws of states around the world, as in Venice for movies? We allude to the Fanfani laws, which perhaps even beat the material offered by Gulo, Seni decrees and laws on land reform. The Fanfani laws declare that they are not aimed at real estate reconstruction or the general solution of the housing problem in Italy, but at obviating the problem of unemployment. The gimmick is not despicable, since the magnitude of the housing problem in Italy ridicules the allocation figures of the various Tupini, Aldisio laws, and so on, while certainly every extra building project puts someone to work. But by the same logic, even the liberators, by dropping bombs from flying fortresses, could say according to the same logic, let's contribute to the working class employment. However, let us see the new arsenal in relation to building necessities. Even before the wartime damage in Italy, without renovating houses that were too old and unhealthy, without uncrowding them from the index of 1.4 persons for each inhabited room, it was estimated that because of the increase in population and the natural decay of houses, 400,000 new rooms would have to be built each year. Today, with a minimum contribution to make up for the war damage and the backlog of construction, and again without any pretense of the depopulation and improvement, thus scarcely benefiting the poorly housed classes, at least 600,000 rooms per year of housing should be achieved. Cost, at least 250 billion annually. There is one big problem that has not yet entered the heads of central planners, of their observers and laboratories of economic and statistical wisdom. Not only housing is needed, but buildings of all kinds, because aging, war damage, and renovation backlog also impact upon these. Each dwelling space entails 2 others on average for working in, supporting various activities, trading, and entertainment, this despite the houses of ill repute being open. The pre-war public economist had already concluded that the state should step in with 20% non-repayable for housing. Today he can conclude that it must step in with at least 60%, but for the other rooms, which would thus be 1,200,000 annually, it was previously assumed that they would come into being by means of private investment, outside of public aid. Today this is not the case, except in a minority of cases, and therefore other powerful amounts of money would go into public budgets. Let's stay with these houses. Against the 250 billion needed to avoid regressing, what do all the special laws give? Maybe at the 10th part on paper? The Fanfani law mobilizes 15 billion annually from the state, in addition to contributions based on the volume of wages, 2/3 of which are paid by the bosses, 1/3 by the workers. Without getting bogged down in calculations, these would perhaps be as much as at maximum capacity of the plan, and thus 30 billion. This is not enough for 100,000 housing units annually, 1/6 of the minimum needed. The problem goes beyond the possibilities of the current regime. In practice, it remains to be seen how much of the 30 billion lire, which is essentially paid by the working class in a broad sense, will end up not in houses but in abundant profits for entrepreneurs, all kinds of mediators and members of financial and construction cliques. And let's look at the figures from the perspective of the employment problem as well. Capitalism and its union organizing agents have already told the destitute unemployed, "Are you hungry? Do you want to eat? Well, invest." "Invest!" shout the ECA and Cominform in chorus to the Italian state and the Italian working class. When the poor invest, the rich pocket. Fanfani, a man of genius, has another formula. "Are you hungry? Build your own house." The formula is so clever that it leads to a further economy. We'll build the house without a kitchen. Let's describe the Fanfani society, a city of shadows where everyone is a mason. 1 million inhabitants of Fanfania, following the pre-war Italian index, need 650,000 rooms. Let's assume a house lasts 50 years, which is already a modern rate, surpassed only in America and aspired to in France. However, in reality, we live in houses that are centuries old. With a rate of one house being built for every 50 years, the Italian program of 600,000 rooms a year should be sufficient if compared with the approximately 29 million rooms that house 45 million Italians. The million Fanfanians therefore build 13,000 rooms each year. How many workers are needed for this task? Assuming a room costs 340,000 lire and half of that amount, 170,000 lire, is for labor, we can calculate an average of 200 working days. This means the employment of at most one worker annually is required for each room. Consequently, out of the million inhabitants, only 13,000 are actively working, while the other 987,000 do not work and stay at home. They don't eat, but after all, nobody eats in Fanfania. We reached the conclusion that the Fanfania construction yards operating at full capacity after the first 7-year cycle will employ 100,000 workers annually to build 100,000 rooms. Pella defended the plan against American criticism, stating that the population increase alone adds 200,000 new workers to the market each year. The Fanfani plan therefore dispels neither the housing nor the social scourge. The best part is that while it boasts that we will finally have houses that will in fact be occupied by workers, the calculation leads to rent so high that a worker with current wages cannot pay it. When you turn to the pinnacle of worker-owned housing, apart from the labyrinth of the arrangements for reserving, assigning, sorting, inheriting, moving house if you change jobs and residence, etc., etc., you will see that the assignee will, for 25 years, have to pay a huge installment. It corresponds to the cost of construction, plus the general expense of the Fanfani housing management decreased by the value of the state contribution of 1% per year, which will be distributed in constant installments, plus taxes, contributions, and condominium expenses. Condominium expenses. An installment of 1,100 lire per month was provisionally announced, but a computation which we omit for brevity leads to the sure prediction of at least 1,500 lire per month per room, and thus for a very modest worker's house, 5,000 or 6,000. In our calculations on net wages of less than 1,000 liras, not all working days, even with the French 12%, the worker should not and could not spend more than 3,000 liras on housing, apart from the privileged and specialized categories. It follows that since there will always be few ready houses and many contributing workers, the Italian worker will pray in the morning, "God of the Gasperi, let me win at bingo," but not at the Fanfani house lottery. If, as with the Freeze, we consider that the burden of the state is the burden of the working class and not of the rich, well, it will be seen how the worker, if the plan takes effect, will perhaps have a house of his own, but will have paid a good double of its market value in waivers, sacrifices, and cuts on his real wages. These are the miracles of the state intervention in the economy, which are all the same with the Mussolinian, Hitlerian, Rooseveltian formulas, and with the Labour Party and the Sovietist ones of today. Not only so long as the state is in the hands of the capitalist class, but so long as there are powerful capitalist states in the world, economic planning is a chimera, a universal fanfanities. Wherever and by whomever it is attempted, it will fail to regulate the facts of human satisfaction and well-being, but will instead build pedestals to privilege, exploitation, and plunder, to the torment of labor to which it subjects populations. And that's the end.